Tim Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we discuss, do innocent people exist? Hell, war, and peace. Tim.
Well, there's the famous line, he who is without sin throw the first stone, said by Jesus Christ. So I'm going to divide this conversation into three levels here, which is petty/civil, international, and theological. Of course, that line I just stated would be on the theological realm, but I'm going to start with the petty level. I don't think it's the case that people are innocent at any levels of these society, in particular, of course, the petty one. It's a common point made by civil libertarians, as well as some people on the left, that people break all sorts of laws all the time, every day, from jaywalking to speeding to tax evasion. The bureaucracy finds all sorts of laws against people. So crossing the street, not hiring enough ex-criminals, or categorizing your funds for your business is wrong. Speeding is a classic example. In basically the United States, many highways still have 55 speed limits dating from the 70s, and the gas shortages and various other things. So I once got a ticket for 71. I shamefully or not shamefully was very nice to this younger female cop to try to get a nice. I acted nice to get reticent to get a ticket instead of getting 71, which is points 16 over versus 6 over, so 6 over instead of 16 over, even though I was over 70. The problem is, as Glenn Greenwald and Chris Cretone and others would point out, is that that the state will enforce all these laws from loitering and tax evasion, all sorts of things when they need to. As it came out with New York State here, the governor of New York State said, Trump's a remarkable individual. We're not they were trying to placate the business community there. I think this is sort of, in a sense, kind of futile. And again, visa is another thing. So if you enter a country as a quote unquote tourist, and turns out you're not you're more of a journalist, if the country detains you, aren't they in theory allowed to do that? This is, in a sense, not directly what Julian Assange got, but Julian Assange did get detained vis-a-vis visa. He is an Australian. He was in Britain. I mean, again, I'm just playing devil's advocate here, trying to use a broad set of different rules. And of course, COVID. Lots of rules people broke with COVID. That's one of the problems with COVID, is basically made all sorts of association illegal from time to time. So again, people might say, well, the state doesn't really go after these people. And it's yeah, every once in a while they do. That's what they'll use. So the next level is international. We had a little bit of discussion about the recent war in Israel here, and we've actually had some previous episodes on that. But when a lot of anti-war people try to make the point that the U.S. or the enemies of the U.S., by the way, too, are killing innocent people. And when I think about this, I think this is basically false. If you look at the concert that Hamas attacked, they were mostly young Israelis. And again, if you don't know anything about Israeli society, they have universal conscription or service time, whatever you want to call it. And so a lot of these people be served or could have served, or actually were actively serving in there. The Orthodox probably weren't going to this hippie type style concert anyway. So again, if a teenager is a potential target, teenage male in the Gaza Strip is a potential target, so these people will be potential targets too. So if you look at if you think about American, for that matter, German, Russian, Japanese, when they had power, bombing policy, it's what you notice is a lot of the same. I'm not, even though I am somewhat anti-war, I'm not any Iranian exceptionalist. I don't think if Iran was the ruler, the regional hegemon, they would act, so to speak, gracefully, or they would probably try to act like the United States too. I mean, I will give credit to Cenk Uygur. Cenk Uygur was on debate over is the merits of the war, and he brought up the fact that Turkey, which I think that is his descendant, I think he is a Turk of some variety, would point out that the Ottomans, there's a lot of anti-Ottoman hatred in the region. So if I think about my hometown, for example, there is a weapons manufacturing. Speaking of just war, there's a weapons manufacturing making a part for a weapon, and I actually know two people who work there. I mean, they, funnily enough, are probably on the quote unquote right of some variety. And the facility that makes the parts, so I oftentimes think about this, is like during the World War II, you could bomb, they couldn't find the factory, so they bombed the workers' houses in Germany. Well, I think, I would inadvertently be a target there. But then I think about myself, am I really quote unquote innocent? And it's like, well, I am in some sense an accessory to the regime by living here, by not overthrowing it, and so forth. So again, this gets into the whole nature of what an unjust war and an industrial economy even looks like, which I just don't think exists. And the United States, for example, puts some of its more expensive assets in the center of the United States, like its missile installations, like some of its B-2 bombers, just so they're harder to hit from missiles and so forth. I mean, so in a way, the U.S. government is doing the exact same thing that it accuses Hamas of doing by building their camps under hospitals or near hospitals, aka human shields. So again, in war, I don't know if any innocent people exist in modern industrialized wars. Modern industrialized democratic nation-state wars. In the sense, the Scott Horton analysis about individuals is somewhat false. And the last thing is, which I think is the deepest level here, the argument, is theological. As I started with the quote from Christ here, I don't think you can dismiss that quote with the context police or the Greek language translation police can easily dismiss that quote here. But baptism. I mean, I think if you really want to talk about innocence versus non-innocence, the question of, are infants, why do people baptize infants? Do people baptize infants because they've already sinned? And that's an interesting question here, because by normal usage of the word sin, they don't have intent. I mean, again, you can try to think about babies and so forth, but normally infants don't generally have intent in their actions. Again, maybe they do. It's like what it's like to be a bat, what it's like to be an infant. I don't remember myself as an infant. There is, as of course, the view that, what happens to people who they had a baby, but they didn't get, this is more of a Catholic and high magisterial Protestant problem. What happens to them if they die, but if they came out of the birth canal and a week later they die for whatever reason, and they didn't get baptized? Are they going to hell? I don't know. If you really think of it in a procedural terms, they're probably going to hell. So again, I just think it's interesting because, again, to go back to the war point, as well as to go back to some of the petty / civil stuff, people don't think children can commit crimes. People in general don't think children can commit crimes, and I view that as somewhat problematic because I think younger children in some ways are much more violent than adults by definition. In certain, now maybe it's in a more petty way. They don't have as much strength or they don't have much capability, which is true, but are they quote unquote innocent? And the fact that you need to discipline children suggests that they aren't born innocent little angels here. Maybe the sort of angry type Calvinists, not to say Calvinists can't be humanists, but it seems to me that the justifications for baptism are like if you conclude that a 4-year-old child isn't quote unquote innocent, then it's a lot easier to say a 20-year-old grown man isn't innocent. And of course, teenagers, I think this is a totally dubious category of children, totally invented. In some ways, they're the most guilty of all, because if you take any understanding of natural law, any understanding of human nature, they're by definition, since they're precluded from marriage, like basically teenagers by definition are forced into a condition of sin. So when people talk about wars, people talk about bombing children or bombing women and children, but in particular children. It's like, they think it's wrong because it's innocent. But if you look at like many conflicts, 14-year-old soldiers aren't a surprise. 10-year-old soldiers, I mean, that's pushing it, but are they good at doing that? I don't know. So that's my long spiel about innocence with it. Do you think there exists innocent people at any of these levels? Please tell me that's the case, because in this regard, I just don't have this bleeding heart toward casualties. Again, I want to state, I don't think people should go around killing people, but the innocence question, I don't know. That seems to be the key question of why a lot of people think killing younger people is wrong. So with that,
So is anybody innocent? So let's take the most broad of theological category. Is anybody innocent? Well, probably not. If you take the biblical narrative seriously, or even Jordan Peterson would say, you even by one's own moral code, you fall short of it, and to the extent that that's deliberate and you think you're culpable in some sense, which almost everybody does, at least relative to their own standards, you have sinned in that sort of relativistic sense. So in that sense, well, no. Then again, the question, as you mentioned with children, is, well, are children innocent? And it really comes down to culpability and what we're going to say one is culpable for. Children have intent to do these. And the children might have intent to hurt you, but they may not realize what damage they're actually doing to you. So they might hit you because they want you to get out of the way, but whether it ends they intend to severely harm you is going to depend on their knowledge of the means that they're going to use. So there is some aspect of knowledge here. And also with younger children as well, on that, even though they'll engage in suboptimal actions, which would be considered immoral by people with more cognitive ability, it's still bad behavior in a way. It is still bad, but it's you can sort of make a distinction between maybe it's sort of metaphysically bad. You're not fulfilling so in a way that a tree that is deformed is a bad tree. A child who steals toys or whatever is a bad child, but being a bad tree doesn't mean it's a morally bad tree, in a way that you could argue that the child may not be morally bad until they reach certain criteria of probably some sort of cognitive ability, because sort of embedded with the idea of moral culpability seems to be, in most cases, that you use your reason and you choose to do things in a way which is maybe good for you, but is sort of wrong in relative to the moral community, for instance. So there's that way of sort of distinguishing things. So children are culpable for some things quite early, I would say. I mean, you can say that, when a child is like 5 or 6, they steal their brother or sister's toys. Are they culpable for that? Yes, in certain respects. How culpable is another question, but they're culpable to some extent. And then on a sliding scale till they get to a certain age, probably around mid-teens, where you've got substantial cognitive faculties such that you could be considered responsible for basically all your actions unless there's evidence to the contrary, something like that. So are children innocent in certain sense? Yes, but I suppose what it I think matters when it comes to sort of collateral damage or deliberate targeting in war and things, really comes down to are these people sort of part of the war effort against your people? So let's ignore here whether or not the war itself is just. So obviously, actions within a war are going to be downstream of whether the war is just.
Swithing, can I just say something? I will
Yeah.
say that they're a part of society. Like you can't critics of the bombing of people can't critics of children, supporters of children can't say they're part of society, but then when the bad things happen, distance themselves from society. Like this is what Nassim Taleb would call symmetry. Like you can't say, like, if you think a children can't commit murder, like you can't you, in a way you can't have it both ways on that regard, just for purely logical symmetry points.
So, okay, see, what I'm saying here is I'm not saying that like a 14-year-old can't murder somebody. They clearly can. I'm not saying that. Um, if that's what you thought I was saying, or even a 13 or 12-year-old. I mean, potentially even a 10-year-old could deliberately kill somebody. So I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying in the context of a war situation, um, the question is who is relevantly on the opposing, who is causing you a threat. So if you think about, well, why might it be fine to kill enemy soldiers? Let's take an easy example. In an active war battlefield scenario, insofar as battlefield scenarios still exist, why can you kill them? Well, they're trying to kill you. And so in a sense, it's self-defense in a sense, but they're putting themselves in an active situation in which they are intending directly or your death. And so, for that basis, it seems reasonable you can use the minimum required force to prevent that from taking place. This relates actually as a libertarian form of defense. Marco on the old Mises forum put together an article, which interesting. Walter Bott liked. I forwarded it to him, who said the idea that you need proportionality in stopping aggression was false, because what you need to do is to actually stop the aggression taking place. Proportionality is all to do with after the fact recompense and stuff. But what matters is if you're being currently aggressed, then you can use the minimum possible force to stop that from taking place. And so that he used an example of like occupied France. Could you go out shooting German soldiers? And the argument, well, yes, because they were engaged in an aggressive act, and you using the minimum possible force to basically get them to leave. To what extent you would think that arguments works is another matter, but at least interesting in this regard. So the question is, in what way are people in a modern industrial society part of the war efforts against your country? So suppose Germany is at war with Britain, and Britain attacks Germany. The question is, who in Germany is responsible for the actions of the German bombers, for instance? I think you've got to go to an analogous situation of, well, does the guy who sells the gun to the school shooter, is he responsible in a way for the school shooting? Well, in most cases, probably not. He materially cooperates, but he doesn't formally cooperate. So he doesn't have the same intention
But
as
so
a school
does
shooter.
but so does the Uber driver who drove the shooter. That's also who cooperates too.
Yeah, true. Yeah, I agree. Well, I mean, so then you're going to make the distinction between remote and near material cooperation. So yeah, I mean, you can say it isn't formal, although you can get situations where you can clearly say that even though, in a sense, you don't formally intend something, you in practice do intend. So Rob Coons wrote an interesting article on intention, and was basically saying that you can't, if you shoot, given what people generally know about what guns do, you can't shoot somebody in the head and not intend their death. You can't say, well, I was just intending to rearrange the atoms in his brain. That seems to collapse in practical purposes to formal, genuine intention. And so in that case, if you knew that that's what he was doing, and you knew that you were the only guy who could possibly take him there, you couldn't reasonably say, oh, I didn't intend that this take place, because, well, your actions basically said you did intend to do so. The idea here is that there's something embedded in the action which you can't fail not to intend, given what you're physically doing. So I think we want to make the distinction between so if there's someone formally cooperating, then maybe, but they have to do some material cooperation as well. Because if you're a kid and you go, well, the war effort's a good idea. I mean, you don't really have. Oh, okay, sorry. Let's suppose you think someone should rob a bank, like you think they should go in and rob stuff from the Bank of America because they're crooks or something. And if you're a kid or anybody who's think that'd be a good idea, it doesn't mean that you're responsible in any way because you have no cooperation at all. There's no material cooperation there at all. You may have a in principle agreement in mind. You may think this is a good intent, but you don't practically intend to do it. It's more of a wish rather than a genuine intention. So in the practical sense, we have the idea that people materially cooperate. But the question is, what does their material cooperation amount to, and how important is it to the war effort? So some authors have distinguished between cooperating for sort of existence and cooperation for direct fighting. So if you were to produce food, for instance, in, say, Germany, well, that's just there for living. That's not necessary for fighting. And so therefore, you couldn't legitimately just target farmers per se on the basis that they provided food for the soldiers because, well, that's something that they could use even if they weren't fighting. So that's not really to do with the active threat, the fighting aspect. How good that kind of analysis how fine-grained you can use that analysis, I think that's a reasonable distinction. And then you're going to get some like more tricky scenarios like, well, can the steel producer, can you legitimately attack the steel factories? Or for instance, and it's like, well, are they actively involved in doing it? Can you use it for lots of other things? Is that necessary? Well, maybe not. I think I asked this to Rick Story, and he said that no, that would be illegitimate to target the steel factory on that kind of basis. Although it did really seem plausible to attack the tank factory because that's clearly directly related to fighting in a way. Although then the question is, well, could you plausibly bomb, as you mentioned, the factory workers in their homes? And it's like, well, are they actually a threat at that point? It's actually quite interesting because I think the rules of this actually go to some of the, well, at least according to the films, kind of like the old gangster code in like the Italian families, like who is a legitimate target. It's like, well, you can't really go and kill wives and children because they're not really part of the enterprise. It's almost as if, because I've been watching The Sopranos, and it's almost as if in sort of organized crime, at least as it's portrayed, is that they kind of they refer to people who aren't in the gangs as civilians, and they almost like treat themselves as like a standing army against other standing armies. But there are certain areas off limits. You can't attack someone in their own home, because that's just off limits. But somewhere else that's okay, and those types of things. Or if they're in another gang or so. So this is just a roundabout way of saying whether we constitute someone as being innocent in a war situation is really just a blown up version of any sorts of murder, really, as who do you consider to have cooperated and what level of cooperation have. And it does see, and insofar as the way our current legal code works and say, well, the guy who sold the gun isn't responsible in the relevant sense, then we can, I think, reasonably apply that in the context of a war and then say, well, they're sort of functionally innocent for the purpose of warfare. Therefore, we should not directly intend their deaths. Now, whether or not we can legitimately foresee their deaths but not intend them and go down sort of like double effect route is another question. But at least direct targeting is wrong in the same way that direct prosecuting someone for selling a gun would be wrong just because he didn't know what he was going to do with it, etc. So I know there's a lot there. Go at anything you wish or take it in any other direction you see fit.
The question about I used babies as a starting point, not because I wanted to be a troll. Although if you assume a war is 20 years in length, which plenty of conflicts are decades long, and that is one of the points Israel tries to make. If you assume a war is going to be very long, then you could say that children, in a sense, have the potential to become adults. And since they have the potential to become adults, they are potentially part of it. And also, I think it's interesting that feminists want to be included in society. If you go back to debates surrounding women voting, for example, one of the things they will make is they don't have military service. In places like Israel, in places like the United States, they're F-16 pilots, they're bomber pilots, they're mechanics, and so forth. So in that regard, you could just say what The Sopranos is chauvinistic and misogynistic. Now, I'm not sure if Norman Finkelstein or Scott Horton would agree or disagree with that point regarding women in combat and so forth. But it is worth pointing out that the modern day conflicts are total societal conflicts. They're not just fought by a small standing army in a corner at a field at the edge of town. They're fought by everyone. So back to the point about wars. I think there's a big disanalogy between historical conflicts and new conflicts. Although if you go back to the Roman period, in that regard, it's more similar to what we're having now than the Middle Ages, to the extent that the Middle Ages were, so to speak, peaceful here. So the problem with the just war theory is that they just don't seem to exist here. So that's one of the reasons why I brought that up. And as far as peacetime is considered, it seems like crime. We've had an episode with Todd Lewis. Seems like lots of different people commit crimes at all age of the spectrum here, and starting fairly young. No one thinks feral children are, so to speak, innocent. So that's why I mentioned that point. So that would be my quick response to your point regarding conflict here. That I just don't buy the clean distinction here. That's an argument against having wars. That's not necessarily an argument against the just war. If you look at the Nuremberg trials, they didn't go after them for the things that many people think they did. And this is where the far left is correct. Many of the things that they accused them are indirectly or directly they themselves did. Rounding up Japanese is a classic example. The FDR administration is a classic example of this, and putting them in railroad cars and then moving from their homes. I mean, this is a classic example. Same way with the British in the Boer War. So I will say that point regarding war. They don't.
Sorry, is your point that there has never been a just war since, say, modern industrial warfare taking place, or that it couldn't in principle?
Both. I don't think there's been a just war, and I don't really in principle. So my problem regarding this is the Scott Hortons and the Norman Finkelsteins. But this also applies to Russia versus Ukraine, too. This is not just local to that. In both conflicts, you and I are indirectly accessories to the conflict in a real manner. Wouldn't you agree? Especially if you take Scott Horton's analysis about the Americans seriously.
You could construe it in that sense. I mean, we have very remote material cooperation. I suppose that the question is, when does, even if you don't formally cooperate, when does your cooperation become culpable? It seems to me that even though we've got a continuum problem, to me, the fact that we can't say exactly where the desert starts doesn't mean that we can't point to a situation and going, yeah, you know what, that's definitely the desert. And we know that's definitely not the desert. And yeah, okay, we can debate between this point and this point whether this is the desert or not. In the same way, we can say, has someone got sufficiently culpable material or formal cooperation when it comes to the warfare to say whether they're a legitimate target? There'll be edge cases, but there'll be obvious situations in which, yes, you are materially part of the war. So I mean, it's clear that if you work in a munitions factory, you're clearly materially cooperating in a relevant sense for fighting. I mean, that seems to be obviously true. Now, whether that should extend to when you're asleep is another question. So, I mean, you're saying, well, you could potentially be a threat. Well, that's always true. But the question is, are you actually? Because effectively, if you're going down the potency route, now you could just go the whole, what's it called, Minority Report pre-crime. Kind of like, well, you could potentially commit crime, and we know that you're potentially going to commit crime, and we have good grounds to think that you're going to, therefore, we'll stop you before you do it. So it seems to me that just by taking the idea of potentiality means effectively you can make zero distinctions. No, I mean, you could say that there is the distinction between potentiality and actuality um, is specious, but it seems to me to be a notion that is used regularly in, as I say, general standard crime. And it doesn't seem to be a stretch to extend it there. Now, if you want to oppose it on the basis in general crime, then fine. But yeah, you'd have to go there and accept it in that case, rather than just merely applying it in the war case. The war case to me just seems to be a more complicated version of crime or defense against crime.
Well, I would say, do you agree with the statement that, like, I think Len made the statement where there are decades where nothing happens, that's peacetime de facto, and there are a few months where years happen. Again, there's different time stamps you can use on the quote. So, like, like between 1816 and 1913, there wasn't that much going on in plenty of places of Europe. For example, I mean, there was civil stuff, but there wasn't that much stuff. But then, bam, 3 years of just total carnage. So do you think there's a distinction? Do you think like it seemed like the important things, and as people like Kevin Carson would point out, on the domestic front, all sorts of big businesses do quite well in the war effort here. And as Han Tapa complains, is like after 1945, the U.S. just sort of stole a bunch of patents and people from Germany. I mean, that's one of the reasons why the Soviets built a wall. People don't remember that fact. Like, they didn't want they educate their scientists and they leave to go start practices in West Germany. So, like, and see, we've discussed this with corporatists like Rick Story, for example, where Scott Horton was on debate over both. Actually, I think it was both Israel and Ukraine. Were any of them just? And in a strange sense, like, I just think, in a strange thing, I just think it could be that the individualistic distinction it could be that, like, Rick, as well as the people prosecuting these wars, the kind of individualist point that Scott Horton would make is just in a sense false, unfortunately. We are in some ways part of our societies, and if you might be silly to say hold quote unquote societies responsible, but if you just follow through the logic of the affairs, like, there's strange ends where we are in some ways beneficiaries of certain policies. Now, you could try to say, well, was that 13-year-old German in Dresden or in Eastern Prussia actually benefiting from the war effort? And that's like a deep question, because Sean Gabb will make the point that mainland Britons didn't actually benefit from the empire. And I think Charles Dickens would make that point too, which is one of the reasons why he makes fun of effective altruism, telescopic altruism, in one of his stories. I think it's Charles, or it might be G.K. Chesterton, but he makes fun of, like, the empire because it didn't actually support them. So you could say that, and this is one of the point that pro-Israeli people make, that Hamas, that, like, Gazans don't actually benefit from having Hamas rule them. But contrary to that, they won't seem to benefit from having the Israeli-affiliated PLO ruling them either. Like, it seems like they don't benefit from either. And if on balance, if they find the balance of calculus is better to have the one or the other, then in a sense, don't you think they make a choice? Don't you agree we live in a society, or are you going to go individualist? I mean, again, I have plenty of criticism of Rick or the commies, but don't you think that's in a sense true?
But I don't see why we can't be considered part of a society without there being collective responsibility for things. I mean, you could argue that in certain respects I have responsibility for the actions of my children, but and so I could be held accountable to them. But I don't see. But again, that's top down. So in a way, if analogously, you could say, oh, well, leaders could be responsible for their subordinates' actions. But it seems dubious to say that you're responsible for your superiors' actions. I mean, there's no plausible way in which children can claim I suppose in certain respects, but to a large extent, you can't say, well, it's the children's fault that I act this way. Um, I, I don't see fundamentally. I don't understand why being in society means that you by de facto have collective responsibility for everything. I mean, it's obvious that there's sort of
Well,
there's
I guess it would be the asymmetry point. If you take the collective benefits, do you have to be responsible for the collective costs? That would be the symmetry point.
well, it depends on causation. It depends what you're causing. I mean, I'm a beneficiary of the fact that we have a schooling and examination system, but do, am I involved in? Well, for one thing, could such an examination system exist without the state? Yes. Um, could I? Could schools exist in some way? Yeah, maybe. I mean, it's so. For instance, supposing you're a doctor, let's take the standard view on smoking. Let's suppose you tell everybody that smokes to stop, and let's assume that the general treating about smoking is correct. But you happen to be a lung cancer surgeon, and let's suppose smoking causes lung cancer, and you get lots more business. Let's you have a private situation, and there are lots of people to treat because people smoke and they get lung cancer. Well, you're benefiting from the fact that people smoke. Well, are you responsible in a certain respect for them from smoking because you could benefit financially of treating them, even though in every situation you go, you know what, probably best off not smoking. It would seem to be bizarre that you could be somehow held responsible for premature deaths, even though you benefit from the fact that people are looking like they're going to get premature death because you can treat them. Unless I'm missing your argument, that seems to be what the implication of what you would say, that the doctor in this case the surgeon would be responsible.
I don't think the surgeon, if the surgeon specifically invested all of his retirement or all his extra money in let's say tobacco stocks, um, and let's say he was on the board of a tobacco company, like he has, like he has some sort of direct interest. That'd be more like how I would retrofit your example to make it more sound plausible here. Uh,
Yeah, but I don't see how me being in the UK is anything comparable for me choosing to be on a board and have control. I mean, especially if you take elite theory seriously, I have no practical control
Me
on
neither. I agree.
anything that's so taking elite theory mean anything, I have no control at all. And if I go around saying, you know what, we shouldn't do this, and I'm doing everything which is, I suppose, it's coming down to ought implies can. If I ought to do something, it implies that I can do it, and if I can't do it, then it makes a difference. So, ought I do all these other things to sort of stop the war or whatever? Well, it's not something I can do. So it doesn't really have any purchase. So my point is, I don't see how being a beneficiary means that you must therefore pay the costs as well. I think there are, if you in the economics concept, there are externalities, as it were, which are morally relevant and ones that aren't. So, for instance, um, you can't plausibly say, oh, I produce a really nice garden. People see it when they go past. You can't just stop people and charge them because, well, you're getting the benefit. You've got to bear the cost at the same time because they had no choice over doing it. It would seem to me to be that your position is analogous to that, is because of they're benefiting from a positive externality that I can just go around and stop them and take some money from them. That would There seems to be an asymmetry when it becomes to negative and positive ones. So, because in the case of a negative one, you're actually causing the problem. So, for instance, if I put loads of smoke out in my chimney and cause people respiratory illness, that would seem to be a harm that I'm imposing on somebody else. So, it seems to me that there's a large asymmetry between a harm caused and the benefit received. And again, that's similarly generally assumed in the legal system. So, I just think I'm applying that more generally.
Do you think? Do you think so? So you would say you're innocent of cooperating with the British regime or the American NATO regime in either war against Russia and war against Gaza. You would say, slash Iran, you would say you're innocent of that.
I could say I materially cooperate, but in a very, very remote sense, and so therefore is not morally relevant. In the same way that the gun seller is not morally responsible for the school shooter. That's essentially my
Okay, I mean, this is some ways just a friendly disagreement in a sense. But I remain skeptical of like maybe I'm just believing the war propaganda, but like a lot of the claims that some of the anti-war people make, I just find dubious. Some of the distinctions they make regarding society.
So what did they
Okay,
do? I haven't really followed Scott Horton. So specifically, maybe with the
um,
Ukraine
if
war or the
if
Gaza situation, what specific
well,
claims do
see,
they make me think of Jews? I may well
the
agree with
example of the garden is a good one in the sense that it corners me into a very easy, easy place to that it's almost impossible for me to get out of like using that example. I'd have to think of some other thing which harms some people and helps other people. Like I would have to try to think of an example of like I don't know, like let's say if like a large portion, let's say 10% of the people are allergic. Like I have seasonal allergies, for example. I actually have a perfect one. So like I don't really like having flowers in the house, for example. But some people might enjoy it. So I don't really want to go into a greenhouse, for example, full of flowers. And it's actually not food flowers that bother me as much. It's the more it's the pretty flowers that I think that ones that really bother me. So there's an example where I sense a negative. And this goes back to COVID stuff, which is how we started the podcast. Because like I always thought like some of these rules they're making about harm are just lunacy. Like they're just lunacy. Now you can say, well, I'm not directly harmed by that. And you say, you're correct in that regard. You're correct that I'm not directly harmed. So there might not be some like general public good for anything or any particular thing here. So Scott Horton and Norman Finkelstein, one thing they agree on is they agree that like, and if you read any man like Kevin Carson, like this is where I think like whether Sean Gabb and Dave Smith are right is a good question. You know, whether Americans benefit or disbenefit from the military-industrial complex is partly an issue here. But like if you read any of them, it just like in a strange sense, let's say the U.S. dollar loses its hegemony, and let's say Iran and Russia create a new hegemon. In a way, we're going to need the remnants in NATO to defend ourselves from revanchists in Russia and Iran from coming back and getting us. I mean, this is this is like the flip side of the Ron Paul analysis about 9/11. Like this is like the flip side of that analysis here. Like like you and I are fairly young. In 30 years, they might come and nurse a wound, and like they could point to Scott Horton or Mel Finkelstein for all the things that the United States has done. Now, again, you might be like Neil Ferguson and say, "Oh, the United States is great. Britain is great. We stopped all this stuff." And you're like, yeah, sure. The garden example, you're right about the garden example largely. I agree about the garden example. I just would say the garden example is somewhat disanalogous to to society here. I mean, and it is true that some anti-gun people want to make it a crime to sell guns in general, which is like pre-crime. And actually, background checks are essentially pre-crime anyway. If you have to pass a background check to get a gun, you're essentially already at Minority Report level. So again, this is something a friendly disagreement here, but it seems like Horton and Finkelstein basically think Americans are somewhat guilty. And actually, like if you ask Glenn Greenwald why he does what he does, or Edward Snowden, there was a guy who burned himself in front of, I think it was the Israeli embassy in New York. He was like Air Force mechanic. He did it, again, you could say that's crazy. You could say that's honorable, but in a way, is he doing the right thing? Is he doing quote unquote the right thing? And I'm not sure. I'm just going to hold agnosticism on this topic here regarding war. which I think is in some ways more important than general peacetime here. I wish it would be. I think Michael Tracy is right. Like, this is an argument against wars. Like, this is not an argument against. This is not an argument for bombing. This is an argument against wars. So that'd be my point here. What I know you have to get going shortly, but what would you make of that, Swithin?
What I would say, I mean, using your example of flowers, for instance, some people harm, some people benefit. I mean, I just say that seems to be very disanalogous to wartime situation. And as I say, and with allergies and things, I mean, that's something that's dealt with on general common law basis, coming to nuisances, etc. I wrote stuff about this with respect to whether lockdown was justified or not, whether you could reasonably go out knowing that you had a cold or something, and that's slightly different, but is sort of causing harm to others in certain respects. So I think you can deal with it that way. I do agree. I think a lot of the anti-war types will probably go far overboard in the extreme, in who's responsible, who's not. And you're right. I think so. It comes to, oh no, they're a child. Is like, well, the way that's used is kind of arbitrary, and he could well be helping in some respects. If you've got somebody who's actually helping militarily and giving intelligence for, like, Hamas or the IDF or whatever, and they're reasonably cognizant of what they're doing, they can be even like 13 or 14, like, well, seems to be a reasonable target. So so I think you're right when it comes to children and ability, and how particularly teenagers are infantilized and treated as
many of them want to be adults.
Oh yeah,
or participate in the conflict.
Yeah, they true. I mean, they do. I mean, whether they are or not is another question, and whether you can really ascribe them responsibilities and powers associated with that. But so I would agree with you that far. But whilst it's probably true in certain respects, there's indirect benefits. I just don't see why that's morally relevant. I suppose this comes at me with a distinct anti-utilitarian approach to things. I think just looking at aggregate welfare of society as the world population as a whole isn't meaningful to moral analysis. And so that's, I suppose, why I'm treating this sort of these asymmetries of negatives and positive externalities. I think that would be my overall statement. Now, I'd just like to thank everyone for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to us on Podbean and on YouTube. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings, and the more people can access this material. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason at all, please contact us at mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com.